Welcome to the 2023 Farm Bill Influence, Impacts, and Odds of Success. Our goal today is to give you the most up-to-date Farm Bill briefing available. We'll break down the headwinds and the challenges and take a look at what's already been done that might put the Farm Bill on a path for an on-time finish this year. We put together what I think is a great panel, and I know that we've still got people coming on board, and I don't want to get too far in front of you, but we put together a great panel here. I'm going to start with myself. I'm Chip Flory, host of the syndicated farm talk radio show AgriTalk. I've been in ag communications for 35 years now and spent 17 of those years as the editor of Pro Farmer Newsletter before taking on the 2 hours of AgriTalk each weekday. Jim Wiesmeyer is the Pro Farmer Policy Analyst. Wave to us, Jim. And he has been covering farm policy in the DC area for just over 50 years. That's 50 years. Jim's daily observations are included in his policy updates available through Pro Farmer. He also works closely with Pro Farmer editor Brian Grady on the Pro Farmer Newsletter. He is the editor of the Agriculture Letter. He is a regular contributor to AgriTalk and works with me on a podcast called News and Market Signal to Noise. I might have missed a thing or two that Jim does, but we're almost out of time and I feel like we need to move on. Jim, welcome.
Anytime.
All right. Tyson Redpath is a principal at the Russell Group DC, which is Washington's leading bipartisan government relations firm focused exclusively on food and agriculture public policy. Tyson grew up on a farm and in his family's John Deere business in Ohio, graduated from Indiana University and quickly started working for U.S. Representative and former House Speaker John Boehner. Tyson also directed government relations for the National Grain Trade Council. Tyson, it's good to see you. How are you?
Yep, great to see you and great to be with all of you.
Fantastic. All right. Dr. Bart Fisher is a research assistant professor in the Department of Ag Economics at Texas A&M University, where he also serves as the co-director of the Agriculture and Food Policy Center. Dr. Fisher's research focuses on solving real-world policy problems for agricultural producers and on anticipating potential policy changes for Congress to consider. Now, get this, before making the move over to Texas A&M, Dr. Fisher served more than 8 years on the House Ag Committee, or I should say at the House Ag Committee, where he was the deputy staff director and the chief economist under Chairman Mike Conaway from Texas. Bart helped to craft and pass the 2014 and the 2018 farm bills. Dr. Fisher, welcome.
Thanks a lot, Chip.
Yeah, glad that you are here. Okay, Jim Wiesmeyer. It's quite a crew that we put together here. And I know that as you were preparing, you know what? I do want to make a note here real quick before we go. I want to answer questions as we go. So if you've got a question, and I'm sure that there are a lot of questions about how the Farm Bill process is working, and I've got some topics that I want to cover with this panel. But if you've got a question, find the Q&A function on your screen, and please use that to ask questions. We'll be monitoring the questions as we go. Jim, I'm going to start with you. In the Farm Bill update that you did earlier this week, which was excellent, you gave a history lesson of previous Farm Bill accomplishments, timelines, and some of the disaster programs payments that have been made along the way. What did you learn from that process by looking back at that history about where we are with the Farm Bill this time?
Sure. Briefly, Chip, I covered a lot of those bills. I've covered 11 of the now upcoming 19 farm bills. And, until 2008, they were mostly bipartisan, but you really can't say that now. There's been some squabbles lately. Farm bills are mostly regional debates, very commodity specific. Ag chairs are very important. In recent years, we've had Stabenow from Michigan, Pat Roberts, Kansas, Peterson, Collin from Minnesota, Combest and Conaway from Texas, and now G.T. Thompson. a simpler trait of all them, Chip, is that they are passionate, and that's what you need to get a farm bill done. And the staff, now this is a tip to to Bart. The staff is very important. Basically, they do most of the work. Bart won't say it, and I will. So you have to know them. The Congressional Budget Office is a key player behind the scenes because they score. A timeline before 1996, the Farm Bill usually was enacted in the year introduced. That hasn't been the case lately. Most farm bills are evolutionary, not revolutionary. There have been some exceptions. In 96, we decoupled farm supports from planting decisions. That was a good move. And we went to base acres, and that's still around. And we recreated target prices in 2002, continued direct payments. 2014, we replaced the direct payments with ARC and PLC. So you can see some of the evolutionary changes then. I can't say we've had a relatively status quo bill in 2018 and 2008, 2018. There were some changes in there. Dairy program changes, livestock insurance changes. Hopefully Bart will comment about what I think he really helped get through with his chairman in a recent bill. Cotton got in Title I and got out of Title I and then got back in. Soybeans initially voted no on marketing loan programs, and they came back in. And my last 2 points, Chip, amendments are very important for a farm bill. That's both pros and cons. The sugar industry has had to fight relative to amendments. They've done mostly quite well. And I remember in 1990 Farm Bill, we moved away from supply controls because in the 80s we had burdensome supplies and we got more market oriented. And we've seen new titles come in the Farm Bill, 2002 with the energy bill and horticulture in 2008. That's kind of a quick summary, Chip, over many years.
Yeah, there's the dynamics of the Farm Bill and the things that are included, like you just said, 2002, the inclusion of the energy title, I think is something that is pretty fascinating. Jim, the makeup of this bill, of the 2023 bill, we keep talking about how big it is, $1.5 trillion. We've always talked about the nutrition program accounting for 80% of the bill. It's going to be even bigger than 80% of the bill this year, isn't it?
Yeah, probably at least 82%. Bart can speak to that as well.
Okay.
And you never know the amendments where some Democrats want to make permanent some of the changes that the White House made relative to our recent debt measure bill, and that's going to add some money. So yeah, I think that's usually a base floor, Chip, rather than a ceiling.
Gotcha. Okay. Dr. Fisher, how would you describe the progress on this bill? Is it on a path for completion, or is there just way too much work to get done?
Great question, Chip. And I'll say, listening to Jim recount the last 10 years, I have Farm Bill PTSD, I think, today, reliving some of those battles. But no, I think there's a lot of questions that remain to be addressed, right? And a lot up in the air, and I can, touch on some of that. I will say, though, our center, we work, nationwide, working with growers all over the country, and we work for Capitol Hill. And so just judging by the questions I'm getting asked and the work that we're being asked to do, I think the committees are well on their way, to laying the groundwork to get a bill done. And I think from a staff standpoint, there's no question you have the horsepower there and the technical know-how to get a bill done by the end of the year. That can happen, right? And that's Republican and Democrat, House and Senate. You've got the talent there to write the bill. And I think we saw that in 18, right? It was the first one since 90 that we wrote, introduced, passed all within the same year. And I think, if all the underbrush, they can clear the underbrush if all the rest of it can come together above them, right? And so I think the real thing driving this is some of those bigger threshold questions, right? If you look over to the Senate, it's some of the comments we've heard of late, now of, they're from Senator Stabenow of no new money for this bill. That's one bookend. The other bookend in the Senate then is Senator Bozeman saying he wants to see meaningful improvements to the reference prices if he's going to vote for this bill, right? So it's a pretty big gulf to get worked out. Over on the House side, it's also budget related, but it's following, the passage of the, Fiscal Responsibility Act, where you have a lot of frustration on the part of conservative Republicans, where it's going to remain to be seen exactly what impact that will have, on the budget that this bill can be written to. And so I think it's entirely possible to get it done. Whether it's probable or not, I think is a different question, in part because of some of these big issues that in a lot of respects are sort of, above the committee.
And the big issues, Bart, are big dollars, right? I mean, it's where we're going to find the money to get this thing done.
Absolutely. When I think, in listening to Jim recount some of the history here too, Chip, I think part of the irony of this is that you'll hear, the reason why we do a farm bill every 5 years, and the historical reason we had a farm bill was largely Title I, right? It was providing assistance to growers. And you always hear it's important to do it every 5 years so you can keep it current. Well, where are we now? We have SNAP that's on autopilot largely, an appropriated entitlement. Crop insurance is permanent law. Conservation was extended, for the most part, extended in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so what you have really remaining is, certainly there's some other things like trade promotion, but Title I is really the big piece of the farm bill remaining to be done. And again, we do it every 5 years to make improvements. And now we're starting to hear, well, maybe we're not going to have the funding we thought we had, which I then question. And I will probably get into this more, further in the show, but I question, well, what's the point of doing this if it's not to make some meaningful improvements that growers can rely on?
Right. Right. Okay. We're going to come back and circle back to some of those issues here as we keep going, but I want to bring Tyson into the conversation. Tyson, I can't believe that I didn't mention this when we started. 10 in a row.
11
in a row for
11
in
Chip,
a row.
Chip, I know you've been busy this afternoon, but it's now 11 in a row. Your first place, Cincinnati Reds. Thank you very much.
That's quite the run. I mean, you haven't seen a run like that in Cincinnati in decades.
2012 was the last time we had a 10-game winning streak. I can't remember the last time we had an 11-game winning streak. So
fantastic. Okay. Tyson, what messages are you receiving from the ag committees right now? Is there a real commitment to get this bill done in 2023?
No question about it. They are committed to that. And I think staff, through the number of hearings that have been held, I think GT Thompson has probably visited at least, dozens of congressional districts for listening sessions. Certainly, I think most states have held a farm bill listening session or a hearing of some type. So the effort should not be faulted. It's there, it's considerable, it's dedicated for sure. I would just say there is a reason that we have not had a farm bill in an odd numbered year since 1985. And that is just because the time it takes outside of the Ag Committee to get the votes necessary, particularly in the House of Representatives. The Senate, I think, is a standard bearer for bipartisanship when it comes to the Farm Bill. I think everyone can expect that all 50 states have agriculture, right? So everyone can expect that a senator is going to find a reason to vote for the Farm Bill. Certainly, as Dr. Fisher alluded to, there will be some fiscal conservatives in the Senate that likely will look for any reason not to vote for a farm bill. But the issue for the farm bill is really how you get a majority of the House of Representatives to vote in favor of a farm bill. That's been the case, as Professor Wiesmeyer said, the last couple, and that's going to continue to be a struggle. The last two farm bills have failed on their initial attempt in the House of Representatives. That's through no fault of the chairman, through no fault of the staff, really through no fault of the leadership. The tricky part, right, is the changes you make and the deals that are necessary for any legislative compromise oftentimes aren't followed through on by the commitments from rank and file members. If a deal is a deal is a deal. Yep. But so often, particularly with, some of our friends on the right and even some of our friends on the left, is those commitments aren't ironclad. especially
Right.
when the final votes come.
Right. Right. Yeah. This Congress, Jim, has shown us if you're making a deal, you better get it in writing.
Yeah, and our interview on AgriTalk with GT Thompson last week,
Mhm.
to me, was revealing in a couple ways. And I have not talked to Bart since that interview, by the way. I want to hear his comments, but GT made it clear that he has a close relationship with Speaker Kevin McCarthy, and McCarthy's on board on a lot of Farm Bill matters. But in particular, what I found most interesting in the signals that GT was giving us, that lawmakers and staff are going through all the titles and looking at efficiencies to find funding, maybe not additional money, beyond the baseline, but I think they can find more money than people think by going through and prioritizing and finding efficiencies. Bart, I don't know whether you heard him on that, but and you're probably helping them on that, but don't you think a chunk of funding can be found?
I certainly think that funding can be found. I mean, and quite frankly, every farm bill goes through that process, right? If you think back to the 18 farm bill, one of the reasons why, for example, the base acres that had been in grass from 09 to 17, they were no longer eligible for ARC and PLC. Why was that? It freed up money to be able to do a few other things in the farm bill. And so there are items that exist. My two cautions, though, one is that we still have several programs that sit out there that don't have baseline, and every single successive chairman has had to come up with savings elsewhere just to be able to pay for those things. If you then also start talking about making meaningful improvements to Title I that would sort of obviate the need for ad hoc assistance, we're talking about significantly more funding. And I don't know that can be done. I'm skeptical that can be done in a budget neutral environment. And so, for the last 2 years, we've been talking about the need, for additional spending in this farm bill. To me, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, as it is, doesn't really address mandatory spending, and certainly not in the context of a farm bill. So to me, that conversation has not shifted. That hasn't magically changed the need for additional funding, because if you're going to increase reference prices, even on the order of 10%, you're talking about north of $20 billion that was needed. That's a third to a fourth of the entire Title I existing baseline. I don't think you find those sorts of resources just in efficiencies. And so, I mean, I applaud the committee for going down that process, right? I think that's an important process to follow. I'm skeptical that that's going to yield enough to be able to generate a farm bill that makes a splash, that actually would, put producers in the position of not needing to rely on ad hoc going forward.
Okay, guys, to me, that's discouraging, because the number one component of the farm bill, and I look at it as a security issue, is making sure that safety net is one that will help make sure that we've got enough food production going forward, and so on. Without an efficient or effective safety net, Dr. Fisher, it's really difficult to have an effective farm bill from agriculture's point of view.
No disagreement here. I agree completely, which is why, I mean, we've sort of said this from the beginning. When conversations first started heating up a year ago, we were delivering this message, and to me, it's not discouraging. It's just a clear-eyed conversation of what's really needed, right? And I think I think the dust is going to have to settle a little bit more on the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Let the leadership do their work internally to move this farm bill forward, because I think it's also going to sort itself out, right? As they start to look at some of these concepts and at making adjustments, it's going, reality will start to set in of exactly what some of this is going to cost. And I think it's great that simultaneously they're looking for offsets. In my previous answer, part of my presumption there was that they're staying in Title I, right? It's not, it is up to them whether they decide to dip into, and that's going to be part of the conversation, right? There's 15.1 billion in outlays sitting in Title II that were added under the IRA, right? That was the climate related funding. It is up to, I mean, certainly the perspectives differ across the leadership, right? But there has been chatter about could they revisit some of that. There was $250 billion added to the SNAP baseline simply through a reevaluation of the Thrifty Food Plan a couple of years ago, in an administrative action. And so, now that does all sorts of interesting things to the politics if you start to look outside of the titles, right? But so part of this question of where does the funding come from? Is it outside of a farm bill? Is it simply from the budget committee? Is it offsets from other committees like we saw in 2008? Is it offsets from other titles? There are a lot of different ways this conversation can go, right? And so I commend the committees. They're keeping their heads down right now. They're trying to do the groundwork to look at, okay, well, what should the safety net look like? The concern is at some point, the funding conversation is going to have to catch up to that.
Yeah. Boy, that is the overriding issue over all of this. Tyson, another general question before we get into even more specifics going forward. What makes this farm bill the heavier lift? Is it the issues and the funding, or is it the partisan divide?
Oh, I think it's generally the cost, the heft of it.
The funding.
And you also have to look at the moment in time we're in. We're coming off of a 5-year period of seemingly nonstop fiscal stimulus. I think the Wall Street Journal appropriately called it the era of nonstop stimulus. And it starts, obviously even before COVID and all of the COVID relief funding that was provided. It goes back to the last couple of years of President Trump's administration, the very aggressive actions he took from a trade policy standpoint, and seeing a need to probably thwart, if not soften, the blow of some of those actions. Went forward with assistance programs, trade assistance programs that were designed to mitigate the tarification and market losses that were experienced. And then, that just rolled into COVID relief efforts, which, exceeded $6 trillion. And what's interesting is we've used a lot of those funds, clawing them back and then really repurposing them, rededicating those funds for other things. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, part of the Inflation Reduction Act, even clawing back some funds more recently to pay for the debt ceiling bill agreed upon earlier this month. So all of that stimulus, we're coming on the heels of that. And so when you have a farm bill that scores at $1.5 trillion, the first $1 trillion farm bill, and you have a nutrition title that's 1.3 trillion of that, and you just look at the cost, timing and the cost are probably not working to our advantage for those of us interested in seeing a new farm bill. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. Okay. Steve had a comment in the Q&As. He says, GT, Representative Thompson, will try to find efficiencies. It says, my concern is it will take big cutbacks to get billions of dollars needed. Hard to find big dollars in efficiencies like you were talking about, Bart. So agree with the comment there. Okay. Jim, I want you to help me pick the topics here. And I want to launch into some of the specific topics that have been coming up on a regular basis. And Bart, you mentioned crop insurance earlier, but Jim, take us to the status of the crop insurance conversation and how does specialty crops fit into that conversation right now?
Well, the biggest thing on specialty crops is you can please Senate Chair Debbie Stabenow, Democrat from Michigan, very much if you continue to improve the participation and the financial wherewithal for specialty crops and crop insurance. That's how you get her vote. Pat Roberts knew that when he was chairman of the Senate Ag Committee. That's point one. You have to expand the potential subscribers, if you will, of crop insurance to make it more viable to more members. It's just not corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and rice. That's point one. What I hear a lot about, especially if you're in the Midwest, from soybean growers especially, they want a voluntary update of base acres. And G.T. Thompson told us, yeah, they're looking at that, but it's like, I think Bart told me the other day, it's like looking in a black hole once you try to get data for that. That's another point. Base acres, because that's what you're paid on, Chip. So
Yep.
that's one of the secret areas of the Farm Bill. And the other point is relative to crop insurance is disaster aid. What have we had over the last few years? Tens of billions of dollars. The secret there is that most, if not all of that funding was off budget. Lawmakers like that because it's off budget. I think that's part of the problem, though, because it's hard to pull that money into existing programs when you have a limit on what you can spend.
Right. Yeah, those disaster programs, we can talk more about those as we go here, but base acres, Bart, are they going to dive into it?
That's a great question, Chip. I think Jim said I described it as looking straight off in a black hole. That's a pretty apt description. It is, for growers that you talk to when you're out in the countryside, invariably a grower is either going to be underbased or overbased, right? And they may be pretty passionate about it. The challenge is when you start to aggregate all that up to Washington, D.C. and start to look at what to do about it, right? And for policymakers, one of the worst scenarios is saying, hey, go vote on this. We can't tell you all the implications, but vote on it. And we hope you won't get lit up at a town hall meeting by someone who's mad, about the decision you made. And I think that's part of the challenge we have with base acres. We do know, at the outset, take soybeans, for example, right? We're about 35 million acres underbased. And so I think, there's a lot of folks out there enamored with a mandatory base update. I think it's entirely because they see that in terms of efficiencies, they see that as savings to be had, right? If you look at the baseline level I think we're probably at 11, 12 bucks an acre in terms of Farm Bill baseline, Arkin PLC and marketing loan gains on beans, and you're at like 26 an acre on corn. And so I think if you bring a lot of these low value soybean acres into the mix and shift from other crops,
yep,
you save money. The question is, who do you impact with all of that, right? And I won't drag us off into the weeds of all of that today, but to say that when you start to do the analysis and you work with the department, and we did this in 18, depending on how far you look back, the department may or may not have electronic records. And so on some of these things we were doing in 18, we could speak to half of the base acres in the country, what the impact would be. We could quantify it. That left over 100 million acres, base acres, where we didn't have good data, and no congressman or woman wants to be left in that position, right? So what do? You default to voluntary. The problem with voluntary, it's really expensive. And so it is just one of the toughest issues the Hill's going to deal with. And so, I know they're toying with a lot of different ideas, down to the point that we've been looking back to the 60s and 70s and the old base renting and base trading ideas from 5 decades ago. Just trying to think of creative ways, because I have a huge amount of sympathy for that grower. And it often, we hear anecdotally, it's a lot of beginning younger growers.
Yeah.
They couldn't get their hand on land with base, right? And so they're left going, I'm doing this. Granted, they have crop insurance, and we can come back to crop insurance if y'all want. But they have crop insurance, but they don't have the income support underneath it when times get bad. And so I completely understand that. Quite frankly, I've dealt with that in our own family's operation before too. And so I have a real sympathy. It's just crazy complicated to deal with on Capitol Hill.
Tyson, what's your take on base acres? It is complicated, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be tackled.
Agree, but Chip, the reality is, and I'm sort of coming at this from the political, how you count votes and how you win that support, particularly in the House of Representatives. I forget the number, but you have at least 3/4 of the House Ag Committee that's new since the last Farm Bill. let's look at the broader House of Representatives. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but just since 2018, the turnover in the House of Representatives, right? So you're probably talking a couple hundred new members of the House of Representatives that will be asked to vote on changes to base acres. You got to rewind for a lot of those rank and file members and say, what are base acres?
Yeah.
And what
And
we
who am I
base it
hurting?
on what? And so just having that conversation, again, outside the Ag Committee, full House of Representatives, what are base acres? What are we doing to base acres? What do those changes to base acres mean to a whole college of folks that are entirely new to the Farm Bill to begin with?
Jim, that was one of your main concerns with this Congress and the Farm Bill from the very beginning. Just the loss of experience, the real Farm Bill experience was lost, and
Yeah.
you got new people.
But the flip to that, Chip, is that it's an opportunity to educate rather
For
than
sure.
have them married to a position. So it's how you're viewing that lawmaker and their staffs. Again, I'll go back to the staff. You can convince the staff in most cases. You can convince the lawmaker.
Right.
So I don't see it as a draconian problem, because I'll see it as an opportunity. Fresh start. Make your education simple, which is hard to do on base acres, but I think it can be done.
Okay. John's got a question for us, and this is going to get us back to crop insurance. He says, regarding specialty crop insurance, any possibility of coverage from market collapse from a food safety recall event? The example he gives here is, no one will buy my berries because of something another grower did. Who wants to tackle that?
I can jump it. Well, yeah, I'm happy to jump in here.
Yeah.
So a couple of things. One specifically to his question, and just a little, generally on crop insurance with respect to the food safety idea. It's sort of akin to what we did back in the 2014 Farm Bill, where we required USDA to initiate a study looking at business disruption insurance. And that was more in the case of poultry houses that were impacted by a bio threat to the facility. But in a lot of respects, this is very similar, right? And so part of the challenge on something like that, for anything in federal crop insurance, RMA, the FCIC board steps in where you don't have private provision of insurance, right? And I think one of the hardest things to navigate on something like this is it something the private sector should be offering? Is it something the federal government should be offering? Well, if the private sector isn't doing it, isn't that enough proof? Well, that study just raised all sorts of red flags about trying to navigate that relationship. And so it's been attempted. There's been an effort. There were a whole lot of red flags thrown up, but that was bordering on now 10 years ago. And so, I think it's a conversation worth having beyond just food safety, right? Because there are a lot of cases like this where it's tantamount to business disruption. And I'll just say in crop insurance in general, on specialty crops, I know a lot of work there's still work to be done there. A lot of work is being done by this administration behind the scenes to improve things like whole farm. In other areas, Jim alluded to livestock earlier. He's referencing the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. Prior to 18, there was a $20 million limitation on the amount that RMA could spend on livestock policies. And so for that 20 million, it leveraged about $500 million worth of protection, primarily through LGM, livestock gross margin for dairy. Well, that was struck. We struck that in the Bipartisan Budget Act. And since then, liability insured for livestock is up over 4,000%, over 21 billion this year. And so there's been a tremendous amount of innovation there. Obviously, crop insurance is, all the talk we have of Title I, our vision has always been that Title I was intended to complement crop insurance, because crop insurance is the cornerstone. And I think that's very much, it's not that we can't make some improvements to crop insurance. I think we certainly could in this bill, but crop insurance is largely working. And sadly, most of what I see, a lot of what I see on the Hill are attempts not to help it, but to harm insurance.
Right.
Let me add my voice here, Chip.
Yeah.
I think Bart's absolutely right. And not only from a food safety perspective, but if you look at what California and parts of the West, even West Texas, have endured over the last 3 years with drought, we really do need to look at more holistically some type of business disruption insurance mechanism. If you ask me, if we're going to get serious about sort of climate adaptation, if we're talking about food supply chain resilience and the strength of our food supply chain, you really do need to start looking at how we fashion, not one-off grant programs or announcements here, there, and everywhere, but really a fulsome insurance program that, for those cotton gins, for those rice mills, that have no throughput because it hasn't rained or you can't get access to water, not for months, but for years. We really do need to take a look at how we fashion something that looks at a business disruption insurance type or some type of safety net program. I shouldn't say safety net, but insurance program that looks more holistically at the entire farm to food continuum.
And that some people would say that is a function of government as opposed to private industry, because when private industry just can't collateralize it, that's the role of government. A case could be made, an example, if you will, is bird flu, avian influenza with the indemnification payments. Now, the poultry people tell me they want to go one step even further on that, because the program, while helping, there's no program to give them the financial ability to buy back birds, to reestablish. So that's another area. But I think this is an area where there could be some wide bipartisan support in the indemnification area, and to get back, producers on their feet.
Okay, this question comes in a follow-up to the specialty crops insurance. What about crop insurance for specialty crops to address the impact of imports from low-wage countries during domestic harvest? It seems like we're opening a big can of worms with that one.
Yeah, I think you pretty quickly can get wrapped up in the tentacles of international trade policy,
right?
Trade violations, foreign affairs. Look, there are means and mitigation steps for the unfair import, whether it's through the International Trade Commission and the Department of Commerce, anti-dumping and countervailing duty processes. Those exist for specifically that reason, which is to provide, the government the ability to investigate and then reach a decision on whether imports are unfairly, unjustly harming U.S. growers, manufacturers, producers, processors, the whole gamut.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to bring up the Commodity Credit Corporation Charter Act. I'm surprised we haven't brought it up before. I know in my speeches sometimes I call it the USDA's ATM machine that both Trump and Vilsack has tapped on it. Is that an area, Bart, that maybe you could expand the borrowing authority for issues such as some of these indemnification issues that we're already talking about? How do you score that? Because you don't know what's going to happen. So there could be an avenue here in which you could maybe put another $20 billion into the $30 billion borrowing authority. And I don't know how CBO would score that. Any comments?
Sure. No, I think it's talk about a mundane topic, but one that has huge impact, right? And this is certainly one of them, the CCC of all things. But yeah, no, I mean, the borrowing authority at 30 billion hasn't changed since the late 80s. I think it was 87 or 88 that it was established, and it hasn't moved. If you were in just inflation indexing it alone, it would already be more than double that. And so, I mean, certainly we saw more of that when we were in the height of addressing the pandemic, right? Would the CCC have sufficient capacity to fund things like ARC and PLC and to handle things like CFAP without raising it? That's, I think, to some degree has sort of calmed down. But now's the time to address things like that, right? Not when you're in the height of it, but when you're out of it, it's less, it's more dispassionate, and you have an opportunity to address. I mean, I think it's fine to address. I think the bigger, more proximate issue right now is that because successive secretaries have chosen to use their discretionary authority under Section 5 of the Charter Act, CBO is playing catch up to that, going, well, we're now going to add to the baseline an estimate of what we think they're going to spend, right? And so now in Title I, or under CCC, price support and related authority, that segment of the baseline, you now still see $10 billion sitting there. And so I get a lot of questions for folks saying, well, couldn't you use that? The problem is, for the Farm Bill writers to use that, they've got to turn it off. And I think the real challenge, you'll see the appropriators, on multiple occasions have temporarily suspended the authority, right? That's a different conversation. And in the context of a Farm Bill, though, I think you're going to see most chairmen are really loath to do a permanent change to the Charter Act. Why? Because they appreciate that they want the secretary to have that authority to respond to disasters. Now, we also have seen, I'm not an attorney, but we have seen some very creative interpretations of the Charter Act over time, right? On what does and doesn't constitute a commodity, and so on and so forth. And so might they try to hem that in a little bit? Perhaps. But I think to really try to capture that for savings, it would probably take a pretty heavy hand. I mean, I may end up being surprised, but my gut is that we probably won't see wholesale changes there. But I also don't think that should preclude having a conversation about plussing up the borrowing authority that exists under CCC.
Yeah, Jim, what else on the CCC funding? I mean, they're going to put some guardrails on this, right? Some definition.
Well, GT told us that, the House initially has a bill to put some guardrails, but he echoed with what Bart just said. He wants to keep it at the USDA secretary's purview. So he doesn't want to hold their hands too tight on that one. So I think that's the Capitol Hill's perspective, even though on an individual case, remember years ago, we did have a pulling back by the Republicans on it when they thought it was electionized too much in an Arkansas case. But I just think this is a potential creative avenue that they should indeed look at. And as far as lawyers and the CCC Charter Act, I've learned in town here, you just tell the lawyer where you want it to go and they'll usually oblige.
Okay. Talking about making sure money gets to where it's supposed to be. Dante's got a question here. And I'm going to need some help in interpreting this exactly right here. Farm Bill 2018 had about $30 million to address labor shortages in 2022. USDA gave this money to UFW, and from the perspective of specialty crops, we saw zero benefit. Remind us in ag that we need to give detailed guidance to Farm Bill drafters to ensure dollars go to intended purposes. Is that a big problem, guys?
That's a Bart.
Well, I'll step in here. It goes to an important point, I think, for my role as an advocate and someone that's a practitioner in this space, and that is to always make sure that when language is drafted, or even for those groups, farmers, producers, organizations on the outside, that when you're presented with or presenting ideas to Capitol Hill, to your member of Congress or your senator, to have some idea of what the effect is going to be on the other side of that. And always suggest that you talk to USDA, because look, this is one step of a perfecting process, not a perfect process. And that is, you legislate and then you have to implement and administer. I'm not sure about that specific allocation of money or program. I would note today, I saw that the House Ag Committee has announced a bipartisan working group on farm labor and workforce labor. I think it's going to be led by Rick Crawford from Arkansas and Congressman new freshman congressman from North Carolina. But so I can't answer that specifically because I'm not sure what that program is he's referring to, but I think it's a good, sort of a good practice to always think about, when something goes into the Farm Bill, how is it going to be implemented? How is the money going to be spent? And most importantly, how is USDA going to take that authority and direction?
Okay.
Chip, if I may jump in here just
You
really
bet, Bart.
I completely agree with Tyson. I think he was spot on. One thing interesting, and I will confess, I don't, of the 515 provisions, I think it was we negotiated in conference. I don't remember that one specific, or that was probably one part of one of those provisions. But in general, I think, it's important, I think, for listeners to understand this process too, is that when you are sitting at that negotiating table, and as you alluded to, Chip, I did that for the last 2 farm bills. When you're sitting at that negotiating table, the ag committees, they want to get it right. And they also, as a co-equal branch of government, they want USDA implementing it the way they intended, the originators of that law. And so you actually have USDA in the room. Congress has USDA sitting at the table where the staff will negotiate, or the members will negotiate and say, all right, USDA, how would you interpret this language, right? And you've got this very iterative process. And it's not to say that things can't slip through the cracks, but for the authorizing committees, it's a very robust process. Why do I mention that? Because so much of what we've done over the last 5 years has not flown through the agriculture committees, right? It's flowed through the omnibus appropriations bills at the end of the year. And that's not a criticism. I mean, thank goodness for the appropriators, right? All of that funding has helped keep agriculture afloat over the last few years. But it also means you have things, for example, a pot of money provided to the department. All the decisions, most of the decisions about how to implement it are then left to the department. And then suddenly you have, producers across the country scratching their heads about how an ERP2 works, for example, right? Congress did not dictate how that worked, right? And so to me, a reason why I'm excited that it's Farm Bill time, and that I'm incredibly hopeful that we're going to get back to looking at meaningful improvements to the safety net, so that we can get away from all the ad hoc, so that you have the ag committees writing the rules of the road and specifying exactly how this stuff should work. And so, but again, with that said, you still have examples like the one gentleman mentioned here, where stuff can still fall through the cracks, where USDA and the legislative branch may not see perfectly eye to eye. But on a lot of those, you're able to sort those things out.
But Bart, isn't that one of the reasons why we have a statement of managers report to show Congress's intent? Above and beyond the legalese written in the bill, you have that statement of managers report that shows the intent of Congress of how they want USDA to implement it, if they do.
If you can make it through, if you read the conference report and you can make it through 1,000 pages of legislative text, then you can get to the plain language reading. The statement of managers is just that. It is, hey, here's all the legalese. This is what we really mean by this. But even then, you're writing that. I mean, the staff, they agree on the legislative text, and then you're writing the statement of managers after an agreement has been reached in the middle of the night, trying to get it all prepped for the floor, right? And so, you've got extraordinary staff working on the Hill, particularly on the agriculture committees, but it's also, there is a tremendous amount happening, and it may very well be, particularly if it's something that an agreement that came together late, where there may be things like that, an unintended consequence or something like that after the fact. But again, I'd still argue, even with those limitations, far better, to get policy in place that anticipates, as opposed to trying to deal with it. And again, to be very clear, that's not a critic. I mean, I'm very grateful to the appropriators, because for all the representative farms we maintain, in 30 different states, that outlook would look a lot worse had the appropriators not stepped in. But now we've got a chance to reset the decks, right? And it's up. I mean, that decision is up to Congress to do that, and it goes back to where we started at the top, is on whether they've got the funding.
But if you don't get the funding relative to the Farm Bill, which is the preferred approach, as you just said, and I agree with you there, then we're back to mini farm bills in each annual appropriations bill, right? If you can plug some holes that way.
And I the awful word extension, and I don't know that I want to either, right? But that's what this is ultimately going to come down to, right? Because my concern sitting here today, and I think it may have been Tyson or you, Jim, who mentioned, all of the stimulus, and depending on whose estimates you use, $5-6 trillion that we've infused into the economy, right? That, just look at the Fiscal Responsibility Act, right? That conversation is shifting. My concern is this scenario where we don't get meaningful improvements to the farm bill and just decide, well, we can let the appropriators continue to take care of the shortcomings in a farm bill. And what if that doesn't materialize at the end of the year? Certainly prices are decent and costs have softened a little bit, but growers are sitting on a huge amount of risk out there. And again, I mean, Title I does not exist to make payments. Those days are long gone. It exists to sit there and do nothing unless things get bad.
Yes.
But where it sits right now, if things gets bad, it's going to look ugly before that really starts to kick in. And so again, we've got a window here to get it done. And I know at least on the part of the agriculture committees, they're doing their level best to get it done right now.
I would ask any lawmaker who didn't want to vote for increased support for agriculture, where are you going to be when foot and mouth disease ever hits this country? What program are you going to authorize then? There should be a mechanism right now, because if that ever hits this great country, we're talking billions of dollars of impact, and we have no visionaries up there to handle that for the future. So, this should be part of the process.
Well, the cautionary tale, Jim, and not to get even more on my soapbox, but we did just experience that, right? 2018, we wrote a budget neutral farm bill. Why? Because pre-pandemic and setting aside the trade war, ARC and PLC were largely working. 25 billion or so over 4 years of that recession. They kicked in, didn't provide nearly as much support as it would have had prior, but you didn't see a huge outcry from the countryside during that time frame. But then the pandemic hit. And Title I was not prepared for a pandemic, just like it would not be prepared for the situation you just described. And so, I mean, we're just at a very unique point right now where, and it is a hard set. It's the point you made about it being unbudgeted, Jim, right? The sell that you're making to members of Congress is we've spent 90+ billion on agriculture in ad hoc assistance over the last 5 years. And some members say, well, we're not going to spend it going forward. Really not. I mean, if we have hemorrhaging the countryside, we're not. I mean, I guess you could roll that dice, but it's really arguing to the members of Congress that, hey, if you want to move away from that and have a standing safety net that a grower can take to their bank when they're trying to finance, now is the time to do it and avoid all of this unbudgeted ad hoc assistance. And so to me, it's a very compelling argument. But as I remind myself now, as I did when I'm staff, I don't hold a voter card. It's ultimately their decision, and it's our job to provide advice, at least in the role I'm in now, to provide advice.
Fantastic. I think we should probably wrap things up after that last 4 or 5 minutes, because that was some excellent perspective on where things are. But we've got less than 5 minutes left in the conversation, maybe 5 minutes left in the conversation. We haven't really talked that much about the nutrition title. We started off there and how much of the total farm bill it's going to be, but Tyson, how big of a lift is the nutrition title?
Well, as Bart pointed out, if you get no farm bill, the nutrition title largely continues. And so those programs are permanent, appropriated entitlements. They will continue. The changes I think made to the work requirements in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, I think we'll just have to see, right? The age increasing for those that are able-bodied adults without dependents, and the requirement that they be employed or be looking for employment. The interesting thing there, though, is that the exemptions to that new work requirement, the CBO says will actually add 78,000 people to the SNAP rolls. And so, I think where folks thought, we're doing this, and look, we are in a tight labor market, 3.6% unemployment. We have baby boomers retiring more and more every day. We had the exodus from the workforce during the pandemic. So I'm all for trying to do things that incentivize work, that get people back into the workforce. But certainly another side of that was, and we can save money.
Right.
Not so fast, my friends, because we didn't, because the exemptions the White House negotiated, at least from a congressional budget office scorekeeping standpoint, and Bart can tell you, Jim can tell you, that's really the only thing that matters in this world that we talk about, are actually positing that those exemptions are going to mean more people actually qualify for SNAP. I'm not making a case one way or the other on that. Certainly when you talk about homeless people and veterans, two really big at-risk populations, probably a strong argument there for that. But the fiscal aspect of that did not turn out, I think, how particularly folks in the rank and file of House Republicans thought that it was going to turn out.
Gotcha. Jim, let's begin to wrap things up. What have we missed? What do we absolutely need to hit?
Well, I think we hit the key features. The pressures involved, so some of the issues, the food issues. I would say, unless you satisfy the Democrats and food in food and nutrition, food stamps, you're not going to get a farm bill. Bart will attest to that. But I think we've handled the financing issue. The funding issue is critical. That we need above and beyond what they can find out from efficiencies. And if not that, you got to up the odds for an extension, which is just kind of kissing your sister.
Jim, can they get it done in 2023?
I would think that it would probably take into early 2024, no matter, even if they get a bill. It's just we don't have that many days left in this Congress, but I think it could be done by early 2024. That's my bias.
Tyson, I see some agreement there.
I said at the beginning, the last farm bill we had in an odd numbered year was 1985. I was in the second grade, so I'm going with early next year too.
I might add, the only extension in the last 10 years I helped write from the delivery room at George Washington Hospital while the son was being born. I hate extensions, and I know the staff and members hate extensions. But with that said, I look at an extension as a much different, it's a tool, right? It's a strategic tool. Chairman Peterson used it 5 to 6 times to buy a little more time to get the 08 bill done, right? We used it, granted, I would not want this much brinksmanship again, right? It waited when we extended the 08 bill in 2012, it didn't get signed until January 2nd. Remember the dairy cliff, right? But that was the if memory serves, was the only one we ended up having to do. And so I would argue there's no reason to be afraid of an extension. If an extension helps you ultimately get a better bill done, because my argument now is what we need a bill with significant improvements, and better to use an extension to hold out and get it done than to have 5 more years of status quo if you're looking through the lens of a grower.
That was one of the questions that I was afraid I wasn't going to get to answer and ask, and you answered it for me anywhere, Bart. I appreciate that, because there are some advantages to an extension, and like you said, if it is an extension, hopefully we end up with a better bill out of it.
Well, one advantage is you don't have draconian amendments too, Chip, if you have an extension.
Right. Yeah, Steve just made the comment on here that an extension will allow more time to look for Title I money, and that's a better bill. That's a better bill. Fascinating. We have covered a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time. I want to say thank you, Jim Wiesmeyer, Pro Farmer Policy Analyst. Thank you so much. Appreciate you, buddy. Tyson Redpath with the Russell Group DC. Tyson, it's great to see you and talk with you again.
Thanks, Chip. Go Reds.
All right. And Dr. Bart Fisher from Texas A&M University. Bart, we haven't spoken before. It was a pleasure to get to know you.
Likewise, Chip. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening and tuning in to this Farm Country Update from Farm Journal. The next Farm Country Update will be on July 10th. Margie Eckelkamp will be your host. Catastrophes add up, how weather events affect ag retail's bottom line. Again, that is on July 10th. We'll see you then for the next Farm Country Update.